a big crowd here for our presentation tonight. I just want to kick things off. I'm Margaret Burns. I'm NHMA's Executive Director. I know most of you in the crowd, which is wonderful. I just thank you for having us out here this evening. This type of presentation, this legislative update, really started a number of years ago in the city of Keene, and it was sort of a regional effort out in Cheshire County to get the word out about what's going on at the legislature and really to encourage local officials to get engaged with their legislators. And Nate and Catherine, Nate, our Government Affairs Counsel, Catherine, our Government Finance Advisor, have really taken it upon themselves to expand this model and to go around the state and to reach out to local officials directly, talk about what's going on at the legislature, but also really encourage local officials to be part of the advocacy process. Even though we have two fantastic staff members who are at the legislature almost every day throughout the day during the legislative session, when local officials understand local issues and communicate with their legislators, it makes a huge difference in our advocacy. So we really appreciate all of you here and at home or watching later who are part of the process and help us to advocate for NHMA's legislative policies and principles. They have a great lineup for you. We're getting to that point in the session where we're right around halfway through, so there's been a lot of activity and there's a lot more activity to come, especially in a state budget year. So I will gladly turn it over to Nate and Catherine for this legislative update. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. So I'm going to invite Nate up because Nate does probably the first part of the presentation, and then I'll take it over with all the numbers for the budget side of the presentation.
Yes, and you have the good fortune of hearing a lot about House Bill 2 and a lot about money, because that's really where we're at in the legislative session. So just to give everybody a brief preview, being about halfway through, all of the bills in both the House and Senate have had at least an initial hearing, and the House and Senate have decided whether they're going to pass those through the other body or not, and many of them didn't quite make it, and we'll show you some of those numbers in a bit. But tonight we're going to cover really four different areas. Our legislative policy positions and how we get there, because we think that's really important, and we love to have municipal officials come and volunteer to be part of that process so we can make sure that what we're doing in Concord reflects what you need in your communities. We're also going to talk a little bit about the legislature and the balance of power this year and how that's set up, as well as some of the bills that are still alive and some ways to engage your legislators. So as far as our policy positions go, we are member-adopted policies, and so basically as your local state reps and senators decide that they're going to run again, or people decide they're going to run for the first time and start knocking on doors, we start our legislative policy process. So every other year we ask local officials to volunteer, come and serve on one of our committees, and have input on that process. And we have three legislative policy committees in different areas, covering finance, covering kind of general governance, and one involving more infrastructure. And usually they start with the basis of what our existing policies are, suggest changes, discuss how to refine those policy positions, and we bring back information from the legislature to them to say, hey, we keep seeing bills filed on this topic. We don't have a policy position, but legislators keep asking, what does NHMA think? We need to know what to say. So then after the committees make their recommendation, that goes to all of our members, so all 234 cities and towns, we mail out to them, and then we have a legislative policy conference in September, which is basically a big town meeting. So everybody gets to come, every city and town has one vote, and then they decide what our policy positions will be on a variety of issues. So this past September, we adopted our policy positions for 2023, 2024. We have 17 specific policy areas, 11 principles. There weren't really big shifts from what we've done in the previous 2 years, but we did adopt some policies sort of in key areas of legislative interest. So one of the hot topics that we'll see what the House does with tomorrow is cannabis. We actually have a specific policy on that now. We hadn't previously had a policy, and there are some other areas as well that we're going to cover as we go through this evening's presentation. So we're talking a little bit about the balance of power, and I don't know if you want to kick us off here, Catherine.
Well, the balance of power. So I'm sure all of you are familiar now from the news media and everywhere you look that the state legislature is evenly divided in the House pretty much by just a couple of votes. So a slight Republican-leaning legislature right now, and the Senate also has the slight advantage of 14 Republicans to 10 Democrats. So as we look at the balance of power, everything we do in our advocacy becomes a little bit more challenging, especially in the House, because we know that a committee recommendation or a bill that comes out of committee with no recommendation is going to be a little bit more challenging for us to advocate one way or the other.
So what we wanted to show you was how it looked in the previous biennium as compared to this biennium. And so the last session was pretty similar to what we've seen historically. We have usually a pretty solid majority on one side or the other. And this biennium, we have a typo, unfortunately, in the House, which is, I wrote tie, I meant unfilled seats, but I couldn't figure out how to fix that in the 5 minutes before the presentation, so sorry. But the House, as Catherine mentioned, is pretty much evenly divided. That doesn't mean it's always evenly divided, though, when it comes to House session days, which makes it really interesting when we come to committee recommendations. So historically, we've been in the position of saying, what does the majority party want? Is it what our members want? And if so, we support that. It's not usually very challenging on session day, but now with it evenly divided, and it's possible some Republicans will not be there, or they'll walk out of the room, the Democrats may take control, as they've done a couple times this session, or one or two Republicans split their votes, or vice versa. We really have to look at what our policy positions are, our priorities, and then work on flipping votes if we need them, which makes it a lot more challenging for us as lobbyists.
All right, so as we just discussed, every single, there's really just no way to predict this year where we're going to end up at the end of session day, because as Nate said, it's really who shows up that day. So the delta is about plus or minus 7 for every single bill, and that's been a little bit more challenging, to Nature's point, because we go in and we really don't have an accurate count. Some people come in early, some people leave early, or come in late and leave early. So every single bill has been a nail biter if it's been a tight policy for us. This has been very different from every other year, where we had 20 to 30 was our delta, where we didn't have to put the same kind of effort into a bill that we support or oppose. So getting traction has been somewhat difficult for NHMA in the House this year.
The good news is that, by and large, everyone has been working together in the House pretty well, so that usually the Democrats take over about halfway through the Municipal and County Government Committee, which is about when we want the Democrats to win. And so we've been doing really well this year in terms of what bills have passed and what haven't passed the House. So it's actually been a very successful year in terms of that. We obviously have to see whether those bills get through the other body, through the Senate. And then we have the other issue in the Senate, which is obviously we have that clear division. So it's a little bit more work over there.
So just to give some general data on the number of bills filed, so there was 1,187 LSRs, or legislative service requests, filed. More than 50 of those LSRs were withdrawn, or 4.2%, and a dozen of those had a municipal component. So that was good news out of the gate. And NHMA was watching 357 bills, so almost 30% of all bills in the legislature have a municipal component. And just to let you know where we're at about 170 left, plus House Bill 1 and 2, that we're still monitoring or following with. Either we're monitoring them to see if there's any changes or amendments that have a municipal component that we would have to be concerned or support or oppose, or perhaps we support or oppose the legislation. So it really depends. So that's where we're at. So to Nature's point, so far, we're doing good, but with 178 left to go and the session having a few months left, we can't quite breathe so easily just yet. And of course, the budget being and the trailer bill being two of the biggest this session. So Nate loves to talk about these bills.
So some important policy topics. I will mention at the beginning of this. We are rapidly shifting to the timeline where you get to hear all from Catherine about House Bill 1 and 2 because really the state budget's going to be the major focus for the legislature for most of the rest of the session. But we do have some important policy topics that have come up in the first half that have been an ongoing conversation. Anything really could happen with these still, and we're waiting to see what happens. So one of the hot topics that's actually up for vote tomorrow is House Bill 639, which is the cannabis bill. It passed the House initially, went to House Finance because it has a fiscal note, and there are some additional amendments to that, and we'll see whether a deal was struck tomorrow and that will get passed to the Senate, and what exactly the Senate will do. I do want to mention that we do have an amendment we're going to be proposing in the Senate because one of our policies, as I mentioned, is on cannabis, and our members have asked us to try to get a opt-in, not an opt-out policy, so we've drafted an amendment to that effect. In this particular bill, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, we've run the amendment by leadership in both parties in the House. They didn't have comment, so we're hopeful there won't be a lot of resistance. There's some technical difficulties with the language is written for how municipalities regulate. It's written more like a First Amendment regulation, so what you would do for parades, because it's a time, place, manner regulation, which isn't really applicable to what you would think of as land use, because the regulation really relates to the stores that are going to be selling cannabis. So it's hard to match those up in the legal realm. Bail reform is an ongoing conversation. It's usually a hot topic. We think that it might be the case that there's some sort of agreement that's reached this year. Last year, there was a bail reform bill that went to committee of conference. No agreement was reached, but it is something, obviously, that has a big municipal component because, obviously, police officers are going to have to do different things, whether that's be on shift longer, shorter, take people to a courthouse, to a county correctional facility, et cetera. So we know our members have a big interest in that. Composting is a big topic, and actually I would say one of the composting bills, the big bills, House Bill 300, has an amendment out of House Finance to be included in House Bill 2. And one of the big issues with this is we're running out of landfill space, and what are we going to do next? And so over the course of the summer, DES and SWAG, the solid waste working group, came up with a 10-year plan for dealing with solid waste and what we're going to do. And that's obviously a pretty big issue, especially in parts of the state that currently have, or may in the future have, some sort of solid waste facilities. So there's a lot of interest in looking at alternatives, trying to cut down on the solid waste going into those facilities. And then, of course, state funding, which is all Catherine's area.
So we'll really get a little deeper into the state funding. But as we know, state funding is a perpetual issue that every 2 years the municipalities advocate on behalf, we advocate on your behalf as well, to receive those state dollars, because every dollar that comes in from the state is a dollar we don't have to raise locally, and every dollar that's downshifted is a dollar that we have to ask our taxpayers to take on. So compounded by the fact that we have ARPA, American Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and American Inflation Reduction Act, and the huge influx of federal dollars, advocating for the state to keep its partnerships in some areas or even expand some of the funding to municipalities has been a little more difficult, but we do know that the federal dollars have an expiration date. So we do want to make sure that those state partnerships continue and those funding levels continue so our budgets don't hit fiscal cliffs. So we'll get into that in a little bit.
All right, so I'm talking about a few policy bills here. We organized these in order of our policy topics, so different areas our members asked us to advocate on. We have one on land use, and there are a couple bills that are still alive and of particular interest. House Bill 347 would establish essentially a rocket docket for land use cases. So the Housing Appeals Board has been fairly controversial, and there's an interest in the legislature to create a new judicial position within the existing Superior Court that just handles land use cases. That was of such interest that bill specifically has been retained, but it was included in House Bill 2, and that appears to be a priority for House leadership. House Bill 247 is relative to protective well radii, and that's kind of a weird thing you might not think we'd be interested in, but we are interested in it because we are interested in housing, and our well radii rules in the state were last updated in 1989. Technology has advanced, and in fact, we can change how much area is needed around a well once we update those statutes, which will allow less area to be needed, which means theoretically we could use smaller lot sizes. Smaller lot sizes mean slightly cheaper housing. And on that note, housing, there are really 3 bills in play at the moment. 2 of these have been tabled in the Senate. They are certain to come up for conversation once the Senate has House Bill 2, and there's also a portion of House Bill 2 which is of interest as well. The first one is Housing Champions. Now, we're supporting that. It is a voluntary program for voluntary zoning changes in exchange for access to new money, not replacement money for SAG, new money for water and sewer infrastructure, as well as roads, because realistically, we need public water and sewer in order to create density, which is what could lead us to cheaper housing. So we are hopeful that that's something that will get included as part of the budgetary process. That's all in flux. That's going to be part of discussions that are ongoing. Senate Bill 231 is another idea for how to spend money to create more housing, and that would put a lot of money into the Affordable Housing Fund. That fund was created, if I remember correctly, in 2019, originally funded with $5 million. Last biennium, it was funded with $25 million, and this biennium, the request is for $25 million. Realistically, the information we're getting from legislators is that there's probably only a certain amount of money that's going towards housing, so whether that goes to Housing Champions, whether that goes to Affordable Housing Fund, or whether that goes to Invest NH, which is included in House Bill 2, they're going to have to figure out how that's divvied up, and it's only going to be a certain amount, because in total, the bills filed related to housing exceeded, I think, $120 million, which is far more than we expect the legislature to put towards that issue. So we'll see where that goes.
I'll cover Invest New Hampshire in a little more depth later on in the presentation with House Bill 2.
And local authority is, of course, an issue that comes up. You were very fortunate in that we're halfway through the session because this slide was very full, and so I got to delete quite a few bills today. So House Bill 307 is one of our priority bills at the moment. It's in Senate Judiciary, and it would require that when there's a right-to-know law case about resolving a gray area of the right-to-know law, and the government loses, the government has to pay all the attorney's fees. That's problematic because the right-to-know law is not very clear. It is a small statute, but there is a lot of gray area in it. And we're very concerned that instead of going to the legislature asking them to resolve any of the ambiguities in the law, people who recognize them will then instead rush to court and, of course, file lawsuits against our members, against all of you, and then as a result, you'll be paying out for those attorney's fees. So we're working very hard to try to get that bill killed by the Senate. We'll see how that goes. House Bill 154 is relative to the adoption of public health ordinances, and that would change how public health ordinances are adopted. So currently what happens is the health officer will propose an ordinance to the select board. The select board will have a public hearing, and then will, if they accept it, whatever that ordinance is, have to get it published by the town clerk, along with either 2 public places or a newspaper, published in town, which is kind of interesting. So there aren't many newspaper publications because not many get published in towns, and that's different than a newspaper of general circulation in the town. And so these can go into effect fairly quickly. Instead, this would change it so it would have to be at a town meeting. It would be adopted by town meeting, which could be problematic for issues that arise that need immediate attention. On the election front, there are a couple issues a couple bills that we wanted to bring to your attention. House Bill 447, which has been retained by the committee. We're hopeful that we can work with the Secretary of State's office and other partners over the summer to identify really a solution to the problem, and the problem is that we have very old vote counting devices, some of which were built before I was born, and they are end of life, and we need to replace them. And there are no replacement parts. We need new machines, and we want to figure out some system that can help municipalities pay for the direct replacement of those machines and roll them out quickly, efficiently, and in time for some period between elections, and get all the local election officials trained so that everything runs smoothly as it usually does, and not have any issues. So we're hopeful we can work with partners to identify a funding source and help do that rather quickly. And then absentee ballot outer envelopes are something that we've been working on for a while. During the pandemic, there was an emergency provision to allow a kind of pre-processing of ballots, meaning essentially the local election officials could open the outer envelopes and sort through things, not counting votes prior to the election, just sort of getting them ready. And there's a recognition in this Senate bill that you probably don't need 2 envelopes for absentee ballots that are hand-delivered to the town clerk. I'm sorry you get to still hear me talk, but Catherine will cover all of the fun stuff soon. One of the bills that was a nice surprise that made it through the House was House Bill 139, which changes the definition of municipal host. That's kind of a technical bill, but one of the issues that municipalities have run into is they've tried to collaborate with other municipalities and put up things like solar arrays, and unfortunately they've done it tried to do it outside of their own municipal boundaries because that's the best location for it, and there's this weird artificial rule that the political boundary rules in addition to the actual boundary of the utility provider instead of just the utility provider. So this made it through the House, it's on to the Senate. The Senate passed a bill that's very, very similar, so we're hopeful they'll pass this bill and hand that off to the governor. Money for PFAS testing and monitoring is very important for many of our members. We obviously support that whenever that comes up. That specific bill was retained, but it's going to be included in House Bill 2. And as I mentioned before, the House Bill 300 about food waste was included in House Bill 2 as well. Or it may be if the House adopts the Finance Committee amendment tomorrow.
So House Bill 257 is relative to the carrier of last resort obligations. When we started this session, there was a bill introduced, and of course, New Hampshire is working very hard on broadband and updating, so everyone is no longer living in a digital divide. But this bill was introduced that the old-fashioned landline and the carrier that provided that service could be relieved as long as the town had 95% service with some other type of communications, whether that be broadband or wireless. So the issue that, of course, came to light was that broadband services may be HughesNet that are $189, for example, for a person. Our emergency services people are concerned with a bill like this because the people living way out are the last people on the road who might not have broadband build out yet because they're in that last mile, perhaps would lose that kind of service. So this is an example of a bill that, while still alive, has been significantly amended with partnership by the committee, and specifically one individual that I don't want to call anybody out, who took a lot of time and energy to work with all of the stakeholders involved to amend a bill so that the telephone companies would not just be able to simply maybe turn off the switch, but would have to go through a rigorous process to vet whether or not, in fact, that community's old-fashioned copper wire should, in fact, be no longer in service. So that's a bill that we continue to monitor, and will continue to monitor as it goes into the Senate, because 911 emergency calls are hugely important because everybody pays taxes toward that. And we have learned that even in some more densely populated areas, there are peaks and valleys where somebody might not have cell service at home or affordable internet. So as amended, this bill went a long way to address a lot of our public safety concerns, and certainly making sure that that affordable ability to communicate is available to our constituents. So more to come on that.
And that kind of just illustrates one of the cool things we get to do, besides come out and talk to all of you out here in the Seacoast, is we get to work with all 234 cities and towns. So we have towns in very rural areas that don't have the services and don't have the kind of infrastructure that you have out here, and vice versa. And so there's such a rich variety of environments that cities and towns are working with. One of our core missions is often to prevent statewide mandates for things, simply because different things are going to work for different towns, and it's often hard to find something that's going to work for everybody.
A great example of that is we're live streamed here today, and you have wonderful technology out here, but there was a bill introduced to require that and engagement, and that is fantastic. We had a town that called and said they don't have any internet in the town offices, and they're still doing everything quite the old-fashioned way. So again, that statewide mandate would have been a tremendous lift for some of our communities. So we are very lucky that we have such a diverse, New Hampshire, such a diverse and wonderful place, and we've had the opportunity to work with legislators as well who have different experiences, willing to listen and hear the statewide issues and amend bills so that they are more conducive to those statewide policies that they want to enact. Oh, I don't want to switch a slide yet because Nate wants to talk about a few of these bills.
So there are a couple bills that we are supporting that relate to really fairness in taxation, I guess is my summation of them. And so ensuring that everyone pays their fair share based on how long they live there, that's the first bill. And the second bill is making sure that everyone gets, when they apply for any sort of property tax exemption, it's on the same date no matter what municipality they live in.
So,
that's,
oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. So House Bill 237 will now use the December 31st, or the IRS date, for reporting those assets for an exemption or credit, rather than maybe using April 1st when some exemptions or credit applications are due. So that way, statewide, everybody has the same date, and they have easy documentation as well, because they'll have those IRS documents in order to apply.
and these bills came at the request of the assessors, which is great. We work with so many really specialized groups within municipalities, and they all do really different things, and I can identify really specific issues that arise, and it's always really cool to be able to bring them into the legislature and help educate the legislature about, here's what this municipal official does that you probably met at some point in time where you're out campaigning, but you don't necessarily know other than when you get your tax bill, kind of the ins and outs of what they're doing and what they need in order to be able to do their job well.
Oh, so now you get to hear me talk for a while, so I'll apologize in advance. So a hot topic every year at the legislature, long before I began at NHMA and probably long after, is the New Hampshire retirement system. So we have quite a few bills impacting the New Hampshire retirement system, and those are our Group 1 employees and teachers, and Group 2 police and fire. Teachers, as well as police and fire, are required by statute to be enrolled in the New Hampshire retirement system. So HB 50 and 114, SB 114, both started as companion bills, one in the House and one in the Senate, and they started as bills that would have restored 7.5% permanent contribution to cities, towns, and schools for their retirement costs. They used to pay 35%, the state would contribute. In 2010, that went down to 30%, and then it was alleviated altogether. And we did get a one-time payment last year, and it turned out to be $26.5 million, went back to cities, towns, and schools in the form of a one-time payment in property tax relief. So House Bill 50, we'll talk more about, was significantly amended, and Senate Bill 114 was laid on the table, which means that the Senate could potentially include it in the budget process. House Bill 555 doesn't appropriate any direct funds, but it would have been a policy bill that would allocate state surplus, 75% of state surplus after the system, the retirement system, after the rainy day fund or the stabilization fund was funded. Then 75% of surplus would go into paying for the UAL. So the unfunded accrued liability is $5.6 billion in the retirement system, and it currently is about 72 to 78% of our rate. So what we're paying, our costs, are due to that. There is a plan to pay down that unfunded liability by 2039. However, every time we enact new legislation that adds to the unfunded liability, we extend that out, starting in year one, adding to the unfunded liability, and it's 20 years is the policy to pay that down. So, for example, Senate Bill 205 would do a cost of living adjustment that was tabled by the Senate. That would have added $119 million to the unfunded liability should it pass and add to our rates. And Senate Bill 57 was relative to the calculation of state retirement annuities for Group 1 teachers. That was also tabled, and that would add $65 million to the unfunded liability, for example. So those two bills are still in play because the Senate could still find funding to pay for them. Right now, the cost of living adjustment would come out of the state annuity fund, which means it would be paid for by employers. So in 2019, a significant COLA was passed, and members' rates went up by an aggregate 19%. So 19% of what your New Hampshire retirement budget line was, it went up by 19%, and it added $78 million to the UAL. So we know that these policies are very expensive proposals. While we have no opposition at all to any type of COLA, sometimes the cost associated with some of these bills is extremely expensive. So House Bill 555 being a policy bill, anytime any appropriation would go onto that liability would certainly save us a significant amount of money and work to reduce our rates in the long term. And the Senate Finance Committee did table that bill, again, for some level of consideration as a committee. House Bill 250, 461, and 436, which are now in House Bill 2, we'll talk about a little more in depth, but House Bill 250 would change the cap for which for going from 50% to 100 in the event of a death, an untimely death. So right now they get 50% of what they would have been due, and that would go to 100%. However, it was just amendment proposed, and they just saw that today, so that would be capped at $85,000 regardless of what their 100% would be. So we have to see where that's going to shake out now, because that did have a cost factor, but now we'll have to wait for a new analysis by the retirement system. House Bill 461 would levy some significant penalties against any municipality that decides to change its structure of workforce by eliminating a position or moving a position to part-time, by going back 5 years for that position, the average salary for 5 years, and then assessing a 20% penalty to be paid over 15 years for making that change to the retirement system for the unfunded liability. Well, we know House Bill 461 and the unfunded liability, because we just talked about that, is extremely important to pay attention to and to pay down and not add to it. We believe that it is local decisions that structure government, if you want to go from full-time to part-time or eliminate a position. And we also know that in most cases, we are creating new positions, or we are having less administrators and maybe more teachers in the classroom versus more principals, for example. So if a school consolidated, the bill specifically would require, if that principal is no longer a position in your school district, for example, you would then have to pay that penalty, even though you're probably hiring several teachers to absorb that consolidation. The same for maybe regionalizing ambulance service, for example, where you're going to use one town's resources and hire a lot more people so that you can serve your town and provide 24-hour ambulance care. If you did have someone working as a director in your community and you decided to eliminate that position through this collaboration, House Bill 461, which did pass the House, is now in the Senate, would then assess that penalty. So to give you an example, the penalty on a $50,000 salary would be about $6,500 over the next 15 years, whether you have the position or not. So that's a bill that we're concerned with local control, and we don't believe this is a widespread problem, that positions that are eliminated aren't somehow absorbed with someone else coming in some other way into our local governments to meet the needs of that community, whatever they might be. House Bill 436, I'll talk about separately. It has its own slide. This is just an example or an illustration as you look out for House Bill 50 as amended, which would appropriate $50 million in fiscal year 2023 from 2023 surplus and apply it onto that unfunded liability. It has been included in House Bill 2, and the compounded savings is $105 million over 20 years. So we know mathematically, and as paying down debt, like you might do with your mortgage, the faster we pay down our debt, we have also compounded savings. So that $50 million more than doubles over the time of 20 years. And while we wouldn't see any rate reduction immediately, it would take till our next rate setting in 2026, we will see some relief, and as we go over time, we'll see more relief. So this is just a good policy. We are excited that while the bill does not give us our 7.5% payment permanently, that this is still a policy that will have a positive impact on our local communities. And House Bill 555, if they ever use surplus, whether it's $10 million, that would be $20 million over that 20 years. That's now in the Senate. If they give $100 million, it would be $200 million or $210 million. So these are long-term policy proposals to deal with the unfunded liability in our retirement system that in 2010-11 was on the verge of what some would call collapse. House Bill 436 has passed the House. It passed twice on a voice vote with no fiscal note both times. It has been fiscally analyzed by House Finance and recommended to be incorporated into House Bill 2. And this policy proposal appropriates $25 million a year for the next 10 years, so $250 million total, to fund retirement contributions for certain Group 2 Tier B, so middle tier employees who are not yet vested prior to 2012, but would have been prior to 2013. So this is a direct rollback of some of the pension reform. Some have quoted it as restoring a promise to those people. They did amend the bill further in House Bill 2 and propose an amendment in finance that would require the state to pay the municipal portion of this policy change as well, because there was a municipal impact as well on top of this $25 million a year, or $250 million. That's approximately, in today's dollars, $7.5 million a year for the next 10 years. So it's great that the bill has been amended and the state has put it, documented it, that they will pick up the tab for this policy proposal. It is only for Group 2 employees, and that's approximately 1,824 people would be eligible. So this would not impact the 11,000 Group 1 employees that would also, by this change, be eligible. That would be about a $1.9 billion price tag. The concern that we continue to have at NHMA is that one legislature cannot be bound by the next. So our concern would be with a 10-year proposal like this to restore the benefits for those 1,800 people, whether or not we would see that funding or whether that would be downshifted in a future budget to municipalities. But we are hopeful, and we did appreciate that they listened to our concern and at least put the initial intent in writing into House Bill 2. So, of course, we'll see tomorrow how that plays out and how it might play out in the Senate.
You can tell Catherine is the finance person because she's approximating 1,824 people, not 1,800 people, 1,824.
Well, it's important to be accurate on how many people the policy impacts, Nate, right? 1,800. 24 people is 24 people. So we're going to talk a little bit more about House Bill 1 and 2. So all appropriations, line by line by line, and dollar amounts and numbers. So I like House Bill 1 a lot because it's all dollars and easily readable for someone like me. And then the trailer bill, House Bill 2, contains all of that legal and statutory language in order to implement the budget from July of 2023 until June 30th of 2025. So the legislature has until June 30th to decide on a budget. Or not, but hopefully that will be effective July 1. So really they can go up until the last minute. So state aid to municipalities is an extremely important topic. I'm sure you've all heard it before. We talked about that dollar for dollar and how important that is for local taxation. However, it does make it challenging in the budget year for anyone to budget because, as we know, you've all gone through your budget processes or you're completing them now, and you don't have these numbers until June 30th, and everyone will have to have an adopted municipal budget before then. So we have estimates going in, and next year our numbers will be much more firm, and we go through this process every 2 years. So it is a bit of a moving target for our municipalities. So essentially, the House Finance Committee's proposal versus the governor's proposal. So the governor came in on Valentine's Day, so it's like a really nice gift for me to come in and talk about his priorities. And then, of course, the House and the House Finance Committee have gone through the budget and gone through all the proposals through the divisions, many, many hours of work to craft the budget with the House priorities in it, using the governor's budget as a starting point. So the budget that's being proposed is $15.76 billion over the next 2 years. So that is an increase of $2.49 billion or 18.8% over the current state budget, but that does include federal funds, and it's important to note about a third of our proposed budget is supported by federal funds. So approximately $180 million or 1.3% increase in additional expenditures over the governor's budget was proposed and included in House Bill 2. So the House added $180 million or 1.3% to that proposal, and then made quite a few adjustments within the proposal. And they're proposing to add fewer funds to the rainy day fund. The governor wanted approximately $190 million, and House Finance is proposing about $96 million to go into that stabilization fund. So just to give you a sense, looking at this chart, you can see all the state aid to municipalities starting in 2008 all the way to 2023. And what we can see in 2023 is a huge spike because of one-time surplus that the legislature in a non-budget year decided to return to municipalities in the form of direct aid. So it was $100 million in direct aid and another $50 million in additional funds available for various projects. So as you can see, our municipal state aid decreased significantly in 2011 during that recession time when they pulled back that retirement contribution, for example, was one, and they really didn't give us any highway funds, for another example. And you can see throughout the course that we have not seen that retirement contribution until 2023 when we got that one-time number. And it also kind of indicates that in 2011, 7% of the employer cost based on today's wages at $26.5 million was still significantly less than 2011's rates at 35%. So a significant difference in that, but still one-time money. So as we look at that, we don't expect to see the budget have this type of graph continue in it. However, we're hopeful that surplus has been successful with whether it's that Senate Bill 401 that gave us additional road and bridge money or the retirement money, that they will continue to think of how those dollars really do impact our local municipalities, our budgets, and allow us to move forward essential infrastructure projects and priorities. So here are the various sources of municipal revenue sharing and state aid sources. So out of general funds, we have meals and rooms tax revenue. That is something that we no longer have to advocate for, thanks to the advocacy prior to me coming to NHMA, so I can't take any credit for this at all. But I'm always excited to report on it. Meals and rooms tax distribution, the whole formula was changed in 2021. And from 2017 until, I have a whole slide on it, so maybe I'll wait on that. But basically, they're estimating level funding for the next 2 years. So it's very promising because we've seen such a significant increase. So that's based on the meals and revenue tax that they bring in. 30% of that tax goes into a dedicated fund every month as it's collected, and then it's returned to municipalities in December. State revenue sharing remains suspended. It was suspended in the governor's budget and remains suspended in the House Finance proposal in House Bill 2. The normal retirement contribution that was repealed fully by 2013, we got a one-time payment then, was tabled, and as we talked about that, Senate Bill 114 and House Bill 50 is now fully amended to have a very different function. Railroad tax distribution has not been determined yet, and there are no proposed state aid grants to municipalities at this time. In environmental, our flood control grants are at $880,000, so just a little bit more than they were in the last biennium budget. There are some dollars appropriated to landfill closure grants, public water system grants, pollution control grants, and those state aid or SAG grants that are so important. So every 2 years or every year, more recently, we advocate for the state aid grants for water and wastewater projects that the state partners with municipalities and offers 20 to 30% refund, basically, or maintenance payment on the course of a bond to make those upgrades to our essential water and wastewater programs. The governor's budget proposed a $27.9 million one-time payment that's non-lapsing out of surplus, out of state surplus, to cover the costs over the next 2 years for those projects that are in the queue. And there were 2 bills introduced to reaffirm how important that is. HB 311, which was retained by House Finance because they have included it using state surplus, and SB 230, which was tabled. So while using the state surplus will no longer show up on the budget, the state would be living up to its commitment to make sure that they pay for those water and sewer projects because towns bonded them, completed the work, and cannot get reimbursement on those maintenance payments until the work is completed. So it's really like funding a promise that you made 2 years ago. So it's critically important.
And one other thing on water and sewer, if you saw the news today, EPA announced they were going to direct about $7 million in additional funding from IIHA to New Hampshire for water and wastewater projects. So we expect that to be dispersed through DES, and I'm sure they'll let you know more about that as they figure out the plan there.
Thank you, Nate. That's great news. Our highway block grants are another critical form of state aid. Those are to maintain, repair, or construct our class 4 and 5 roads. And there is a formula that they use the road toll or the gas tax. In addition to state motor vehicle registrations, and municipalities get 12.5% of that. So those go back in 4 quarterly payments to cities and towns, and it's critical for our local infrastructure. SB 270 is a separate bill that would do another one-time payment of $40 million for roads and bridges, 20 for roads and 20 for bridges, very similar to what we saw in SB 401. So we're very hopeful that if there are those surplus funds, that we will see that additional investment, because with supply chain issues and inflation, we know that paving that mile of road got a lot more expensive, so everything that we budgeted for our 5-year and 6-year plans got so much more expensive. We know SB 401 for one community, for example, was going to have to take some roads off of that schedule, and because of those dollars, was able to add it back on and stay on their schedule. So critical dollars. Oh, I should just add that we do have a municipal state aid and revenue sharing publication that we publish every 2 years, so it has been updated with all of last year's numbers, and we go into a lot of detail. It's about 26 pages long, into all of these subject areas if you would like to know more. So for meals and revenue, the distribution history, it's wonderfully important that we are acknowledging that the state has reaffirmed its commitment to sharing that revenue with municipalities. From 2017 to 2021, we received $68.8 million through the budget process. Now we receive an actual dollar amount based on the state doing better. So as we continue to have a strong economy, which we do, especially in nationally, our economy is considered quite strong. Our unemployment is quite low. Travel and tourism is still strong. We will continue to see that additional revenue come in. So we received $100 million in the first year of the plan over that $68.8 million, so a significant increase, or 45%. And we received $120 million distributed by population to all the towns this past year. So that's a 75% increase over the old way of doing business. So again, extremely transformative dollars that we continue to hope that the state does not adjust that partnership in any way, and there's no proposal on the table to do so. So as you can see from this graph, it is highlighting that trend over time. Another graph that I like to share, it shows that block grant and bridge aid funding. And as you can see, in 2018, we received a one-time payment in the orange bar, much like we did last year in the orange bar in 2023 for road and bridge aid. So significant. In 2018, it was only for class 4 and 5 roads. In 2023, we saw it for both roads and bridges. And of course, those dollars can be paired with the state bridge aid program or with the federal programs to work on our infrastructure, so many towns are able to leverage those dollars and not have to raise them locally. So for highway funding and where we are with the budget, it is a little early because, of course, this funding, based on 12% of the road toll or the gas tax and registration fees, it's a little early to tell because there's still state revenues only 8 months in, so they still have several months to go before we have more actuals. So, for example, in 2022, we had $34.3 million allocated. That was our actual dollars. And in 2024, they're estimating $32 million. So there is a $4.6 million decrease in the next budget cycle predicted. However, House Bill 2, based on new estimates that House Finance just got, added an additional $504,000 per year. And we're hoping by the time it gets through Finance, we see that number continue to shrink and those block grants stay intact. Municipal bridge aid, all the little red dots on this Superfund chart are the red-listed bridges. We currently have 222 red-listed bridges in New Hampshire, and there is a commitment from the state to fund $6.8 million a year to assist, with the state paying 80% of those costs and the municipality paying 20%. That program goes until 2034. The wait list is based on priority need and the acceptance of the aid. And then, of course, the DOT will pair that with federal dollars that have come in. And for example, in 2026, they just started sending out letters for projects starting in 27. There'll be $90 million in additional dollars to continue to take these red-listed bridges off. So between the two pots of money, we usually see between 10 and 20 bridges come off a year, but we will see more based on some of the federal dollars that are coming in. So that's very positive news for New Hampshire. Some of the other interesting areas that we want to touch on with House Bill 2 is the governor's budget proposed a removal of 34 licenses required by the state and eliminating 4 regulatory boards. However, most of that has been completely overhauled in House Bill 2. House Finance did not want to take up policy work, rightfully so. There was a bill, House Bill 655, which dealt with some of this. And of course, many of these licenses, whether it was for an LNA or nursing or assessors, wetland scientists, all came forward to express their concerns with the proposal. So it seems like they put a soft freeze on this, and they are going to maybe take this much slower. So much of what we saw, it will look nothing like what it did in the original version of House Bill 2, which you feel like reading it from page 97 to 200 and something, 220 something, is all of those regulatory changes from the Office of Professional Licensure. So much of that has been completely reduced when you look at another version of House Bill 2. Medicaid reimbursement rate increases have had bipartisan support in both houses, so we're very hopeful that we're going to see that enacted. The LCHIP program that many of us love and have been awarded, they're maintaining that current funding level of $5 million. They're creating a new program for state and local cybersecurity. They're appropriating $1.2 million in fiscal year 24 and $1.6 in 25 for cybersecurity grants for local municipalities, because we know that we are targets and easy targets of cybercrime. And we have, unfortunately, known several of our municipalities that have had devastating consequences to those attacks. There's also was a proposed elimination of the second injury fund, but that was restored by House Finance, so we just want to report out on that. If you listen to some of our other webinars or some of our reports, we want to make sure that there's no misinformation out there, and that would make sure that employers are able to pay for an impaired worker if there was a cost barrier to that employment should they have been injured prior to coming on the job. That is intact, so I think that's important to highlight because that's an important fund. So we talk a little bit about state surplus, just to give us a sense of where we are. The budget surplus as of February 2023 is $347 million between the general fund and the education trust fund. Last year, the state had $430 million in surplus, and the legislature between January and June allocated $261 million of that, or 60%, where, as I mentioned, $100 million was directed toward municipalities, with $100 in direct aid, so significant proposal led to significant savings to our local taxpayers and our local budgets. In the next budget proposal, there are some uses of those one-time funds. So $15 million would be allocated, rather than the governor's 25, to Invest New Hampshire, which is a program that allows municipalities to apply for grants. They also had a component for developers. In this proposal, it would just be $15 million for municipalities. Developers were taken out of the proposal in House Bill 2, and another $15 million for the Affordable Housing Fund using state surplus. And again, we talked briefly about those wastewater grants. $27 million would be allocated toward that wastewater SAG program. That's a partnership with municipalities. And then adding the $96 million to the rainy day fund. So when we start to add that up, it really starts to pare away at the available state surplus for maybe other priorities the legislature might have. And as we continue to craft the budget, I imagine we will continue to see proposals to do some one-time funding out of state surplus within the budget process.
And I'll just say that we've been following very closely, and about every half hour today, there was a release of a new floor amendment for House Bill 2, and I remember one of those being changing the $15 million to the Affordable Housing Fund to changing it back to $30 million. So there's a lot of moving parts that are going to happen tomorrow, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you. It's a good up. See, we can't even keep up. We can't even keep up. So I'll let Nate talk for a minute because you've heard me speak for so long. I apologize for that.
Yeah, and so that just kind of leads into, we really want you all to stay informed. So just to give you a preview of what our headline is in the legislative bulletin this Friday, it's either going to be House passes budget or House does not pass budget, and we don't know which one's going to get published yet, or what exactly that's going to look like. So it's going to be a long day tomorrow for us writing it, and hopefully a short day for the House, because hopefully they'll have an agreement, and we can then spend some time going through the potential changes to make sure we get those summarized for you. And we really want to make sure we do everything we can to help keep you informed. So of course we have our weekly bulletin that comes out on Fridays, but we also want local officials to engage with their legislators and their legislators to engage with your local officials because you'll have expertise. And that expertise is really important to bring to the legislature. I can't tell you the number of hearings I've been in at this point in time where we've had someone who has some expertise come in and talk about, whatever their subject area is, and it's very different than what all of us who just sit there and kind of read about it imagine. And it's really critical to have those conversations at the local level and start building those relationships as well as having them in Concord. It's a little bit harder when you have 3 minutes to explain, some really specific area of the law or something that requires a lot of background. So for example, we did a training back in November or December on the default budget. We have a recording of that webinar. It's about an hour and a half, I think. So when we go to the legislature and talk to them about the default budget, they don't want to hear us talk for an hour and a half. So we do rely a lot on our members to help inform legislators about how things work at the local level. And we encourage you to have kind of informal meetings, bring them around to your departments, talk with them, let them know who they can call when they have questions about specific areas. And to our end, we of course publish the bulletin every week, and we also sometimes do calls to action via email. We sometimes call you directly and ask you to call specific legislators, and thank you, all of you who have done that for us. And we now have some fancy new software called Fast Democracy, where we are publishing the bills we're tracking online publicly so anybody can look them up, as well as our positions, and we summarize the bills to the best of our ability when we have positions on them, and try to keep those updated as amendments are recommended or passed. So we encourage you to check out our bill tables. You can also subscribe if you have a particular area of interest, land use, for example, and get updates every week. Those come out on Fridays or every day if you are so inclined.
It updates every 4 minutes if you're really excited about a bill.
Yes, so we got lots of emails today about House Bill 2. And we want to thank, of course, the Town of Exeter for inviting us today and hosting us. We really appreciate this. We appreciate the opportunity, not only because I was persuaded to stop in some of the lovely chocolate shops that are on the main drag here.
And don't forget about the cupcake truck.
Yes, the cupcake truck in the parking lot of the town offices. So, I'm not saying any other town should improve what they're doing, but I'm just saying the cupcake truck was very persuasive. So we're happy to take any questions anybody has, and thank you again for coming out this evening. I know especially the legislators are very busy getting a number of voicemails this evening about how they should vote on things tomorrow. So thank you. Yes, so the Rocket Docket is compared to the Right to Know Ombudsman. So the Housing Appeals Board is still going to exist under the Rocket Docket proposal. I assume what would happen, without kind of predicting the future, is that if it is the case that the judicial branch picks a judge to hear land use cases and it goes well over the next couple of years, the legislature will see a proposal to eliminate the Housing Appeals Board. The Right to Know Ombudsman was created for a simpler process, in theory, for right-to-know law cases to go before basically a judge, and then resolve those faster and cheaper than you normally see with a filing with Superior Court. personally, I think it's kind of interesting because what we've seen in a number of other states is the legislature in those states have recognized that there are very specialized areas of the law. They've worked with the judicial branch to kind of create special judgeships, and that's kind of how we are viewing the right to know ombudsman. The ombudsman has had, as you said, a number of cases filed already, and we are working on learning more about that process. He has to adopt rules at some point in time, and is currently working under some existing rules previously adopted by the AG's office, along with an email to us describing the rules, basically said is, and other changes as necessary by necessitated by the cases. So we'll see what the process ends up being. So it's not really clear what the Special Committee on Housing is going to do. They've had a couple of informational sessions, and we were asked to ask around for some planners to come and speak to them, and so the City of Dover came and volunteered. They were suggested because they're doing that neat thing with the small cabins. And they're gathering information and will presumably make some kind of recommendation of what legislation should be passed. But as far as the actual procedural process for, okay, the bill's been tabled, is it going to be sent over to them or not? I don't know. And there's nothing in the House rules that I've seen that clearly indicates that. So it seems more likely that they tried to, or that he did table the housing bills because in theory, a bill can't be filed on the same subject or substantially similar subject in the second year of the biennium. So any of the bills that were killed previously, they couldn't refile. That rule hasn't always been adhered to as strictly as it might be, so I don't know how clearly it will be adhered to in the second biennium.
So you know that one of the bills
The ADU is a duplex bill, yes. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
I'm sorry, the ADU bill was tabled, and one of the reasons given, because the sponsor is on the Special Committee for Housing, said, let's wait until the Special Committee on Housing comes up with something. So I see some future consternation.
Should share your fun fact.
Yes, so...
Has a great fact on ADUs.
So I did get to sit through that. One of the cool things about NHMA is we've kept a lot of paper files from back in the day, and I've gotten to read through a lot of them on housing. So one of the fun things that happened was the special committee had an economist and an attorney from George Mason University come in to present on what they found out. And they actually did a special study on New Hampshire's ADU law passed in 2017 and compared that to other states that have ADU laws. And as it turns out, the municipalities they gathered information from, I think with the exception of one of them, had a higher rate of ADU adoption than any other state, including those with what are called model ADU ordinances, or what have previously been called that. And we saw the same thing with fourplexes as well. So obviously we didn't gather that data, they did, but that's kind of interesting that there have been arguments to put in these statewide zoning mandates to, in theory, increase the availability of these alternative housing forms, ADUs, fourplexes, Yet when they've pulled the data, we actually have a higher number per housing units than elsewhere in the country. I don't know how that's explained, but that's what the data that they presented showed. So we'll see what that means to legislators.
There was a bill in the House, and I can't remember the number, but it was a bill that would allow for the construction of up to 4 additional units if there was water and sewer connection.
Yep, House Bill 44.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, I was concerned about the impact that would, or the stress that would put on our infrastructure. I mean, I don't recall what your position was, or did you have a position on that?
So we oppose that because it's a statewide zoning mandate. One of the very important things to know about water and sewer infrastructure is if you look at the map that DES could provide you of where public water and sewer is available, that doesn't always mean that water and sewer has capacity. And when I'm talking about capacity, there are different components of that. So it may be something like, hey, we need to run a larger pipe from the house to the street connection, which is pretty simple to solve. It may be the case that you need to run a larger pipe diameter down the street, which is more expensive, or all the way back to the well or the treatment facility. Or it may be the case that the treatment facility itself is already at capacity. So if you look at something like, just to compare two municipalities, Manchester and Concord has a lot of excess capacity at their wastewater treatment facility as compared to Manchester. Manchester's pretty close to maxed out. Now, there are different possibilities of what somebody could build that would increase that load. So something like a computer chip manufacturer is going to use a ton of water. That's basically going to use up, if they were to build that in Concord, probably all of the excess capacity in Concord. They probably can't build that in Manchester because there isn't enough capacity, but you could build more housing units in Concord than you could in Manchester based on what the capacity levels are based on kind of how those systems are designed. So the cost of upgrades for building in Concord is going to be less than Manchester, because Manchester, you're going to have to upgrade the treatment facility, which is going to be tens of millions of dollars, rather than something that's just a pipeline. And pipelines are running at this point in time about $2 million per mile. So that's a really important component. And the policy decision the legislature needs to make is who pays for that. And historically, it's been the case that the developers paid for that, which has made some developments not really feasible, because your other option is the taxpayers pay for it. So.
Just another question. I mean, what is your response to the argument you'll hear from people that say that one of the biggest obstacles to addressing our housing needs in the state is local zoning regulations, that, we somehow have to just get beyond some of the restrictions that the localities are putting in place to enable us to develop some of the solutions that we need.
So if we break down the cost of housing, we break it down into basically 5 parts. The cost of land, the cost of the labor to build the housing, the cost of the materials. Those 3 components together, if you're talking about like a 1,600 square foot house, which is pretty average, it's going to be about $205 per square foot, which is about $328,000. That's not including any sort of profit for the developer or nothing. That's just the actual building cost at this moment in time for a single family home. You can obviously reduce those costs by reducing the amount of land, reducing the size of the house. Can't really reduce labor costs because the average age of an electrician in New Hampshire is 55 and plumbers are older, so you really have a limited supply of labor. The municipal component, really, you have kind of 2 sides of it. One, any kind of that necessary upgrade cost, so, running the pipe for the water and sewer infrastructure. And then you have any kind of local fees, which isn't a significant amount. And in terms of where you're going to place that housing, you have to be conscious of, what the best use of that land is. And so that's usually determined at the local level as part of the zoning process, where they're determining different regions. And if you're not going to have public water and sewer, you can only have a certain density, and it's going to be spread out, the housing, and that's going to obviously require more additional costs because it's going to be longer for the firemen to go there, or the police cars, or anything else, or paving the roads, or any of the maintenance. So there's going to be costs on one side or the other. It's going to be very difficult to overcome, and the largest component is not going to be a municipal cost. It's going to be some sort of cost related to the actual building of the house.
And one other area for land value capture it is often looked at when building housing is what's desirable. Where are there jobs? Where is there access to public transportation? So when you go out to your most rural towns that might seem to have restrictive zoning, they have no water and sewer for density. They have no public transportation. They're an hour from a grocery store, so maybe an hour from employment. So while you can theoretically build a lot there, what it would take to develop that so it's desirable to even move there in the first place and make sure those people have access to, schooling, transportation, employment, childcare, you're starting, it's insurmountable. So that's why we see density always being built up in our more, already built up areas, because it just makes sense as we go out, which we see in places like Boston, for example, or New York. It just keeps spreading. But that would be a huge barrier, especially for like the northern country, where they could probably build, I wouldn't even want to guess how much they could build, but then what? Yeah. Right, so that's a consideration.
And one other component of that too is, whatever proposal comes before a planning board, no matter what the zoning is going to be based on what the developer thinks is profitable, assuming it's not someone building their own house. So if you look at some place, again, I live in Concord, and I follow it very closely. So there was a site, the old Concord Monitor site, where they owned a bunch of forest. It's just forest. And there was an initial proposal last year before our planning board, which had a fairly high density, and then the developer came back, and I don't know if they cut it in half, but cut the density down pretty significantly, because they said, well, single-family homes are going to sell better than the duplexes that we wanted to build initially. So there's a big component related to, what's the market want.
I'll hold the mic in case anybody else wants to ask a question.
Sounds good. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you for coming out this evening and spending your evening with us. We're very pleased to be here. We loved spending the evening in Exeter, and it was great to visit your town, so thank you.